předposlední přednášce toho cyklu, nejdříve krátká anotace příští přednášky, poslední bude mluvit Ivan Rehák o záchranném programu gaviálu, na ochranu gaviálu a o tom, na příkladu z toho případu, o tom, jak podobné záchranné programy můžou končit. A dnešní přednášce. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Brian Enquist. Many of you actually know him already because he was here almost 2 years ago in the fall of 2007. And Brian Enquist is a professor at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Arizona and also a member of the Santa Fe Institute. He is basically a plant ecologist, but he's also a great theoretical ecologist, and he's one of the fathers of metabolic theory of ecology. And now, today, he is going to talk about general laws in biology, or whether they are any general laws.
So, thank you very much, David, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you once again. I hope I don't overstay my welcome by giving several talks in a short period of time. But I would like to say first and foremost a big thank you to David for inviting me here, and also thanks to Charles University and CTS for being such gracious hosts. My stay is going to be a little longer this time, so I'd be interested in meeting with anybody if people are interested in either talking about aspects of plant ecology research that I do, or kind of the more general topics that I'm going to cover in today's talk. So when David asked me to give another talk here, we had several back and forths in terms of a discussion about what may be a suitable and hopefully exciting topic for you. I told David that I had recently given a talk with this title that sounds kind of strange. You know, why should we care about general laws? And David thought, not to put David on the spot here, but said, oh, that sounds like a very exciting talk. Now, granted, David hasn't heard what I'm going to tell you about, so he may regret making that decision. But what I would like to say is parts of this talk actually came together while we were trying to stage kind of a defense for macroecology and why do macroecology. And many of the things I'm going to talk about today have been inspired by kind of a need to kind of justify some of the new science that we're trying to do, because it has encountered quite a bit of criticism in some parts of biology. And I'll also say that this is still pretty much a reflection of my thinking right now. And I will be completely honest to say that I'm still working through a lot of these issues in my head, and my logic may not be entirely perfect, but it essentially reflects where I am. And in presenting this, I have an opportunity then to discuss these ideas with you and hopefully improve my logic in the end. All right, so that's where we are. So, in the age of Darwin, are there general laws in biology, and should we even care? Should we even be talking about this? So, as many of you know, 200 years ago basically marks the date of the publication of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. But we should also know that Alfred Russel Wallace also shares the distinction for also co-discovering evolution by natural selection. And so I think at this time, not only should we say happy birthday to Darwin, but we should stop and think, use this time to reflect. After 200 years, what have we learned? Okay? And despite what you may be thinking, I'm not here to bash Darwin. In fact, I'm here to embrace Darwin. But I'm here to do something a little different, to take what we've learned from Darwin and then push ahead even further. And I think now it's a good time to ask, well, 200 years since the publishing, since the birth of Charles Darwin, how has biology then been transformed by Darwin? So 200 years since Darwin. Well, obviously biology is central to many of the sciences right now. I think no one would deny that. And if I were to boil everything down to 2 points. You may not agree with this, but from my perspective, I think we've gained 2 central insights. The one is pretty obvious. And to quote Dobzhansky, nothing in biology makes sense unless in the light of evolution. Okay? And so evolution by natural selection, evolution by other forces, obviously is absolutely central to our understanding of biology. But also, the second point that I would bring up is that there's been an absolute tremendous success of reductionism. That is, what we've been able to detail is that biological phenomena are horrendously complex and wonderful at the same time. And that's great, okay, because we've learned a lot. And reductionism has taught us a lot about how the world works. And essentially, reductionism is an approach to understanding complexity of the world around us. And essentially what we do when we do reductionism is reducing this complexity to and describing all of the interaction of all of the parts. So describing and understanding all of the interactions that occur. And so this can occur at the subcellular level or within a nice tropical forest. We've learned quite a lot. So what I would like to do is give you just 4 examples that I think really mark the success of reductionism in terms of our understanding of complexity, our understanding of biological complexity. Now, some of these are fairly obvious, and you'd list these yourself. And the first is really revealing the detail and inner workings of the cell, okay? From not only the kind of the gross anatomy of the cell, but the inner workings of organelles, delving inside organelles to the individual membranes where we can then describe the individual kind of key molecules that are responsible for a lot of cellular metabolism, in this case cytochrome oxidase. So not only do we understand cytochrome oxidase in the biochemistry, but we know the intricate details of the molecules that actually comprise cytochrome oxidase itself. Okay, and so if I were to choose one picture to summarize our amazing knowledge of the inner workings of the cell, it would be this one. Okay, so does anyone know what this is? Right? It's the metabolic, if you can read, it's a very nice road map. This could be, gosh, the street map of London for all I'm concerned, but this is a road map of the metabolic pathways within the cell, okay? And oftentimes we tend to focus on specific ones like the citric acid cycle and so on, but we should realize that within the cell, the biochemistry that takes place is not only amazingly complex, okay, but wonderful in terms of its detail. Okay, kind of the second, I think, really big insight in terms of kind of underlying biological complexity is the molecular basis of inheritance, right? So we all know Watson and Crick. So what their discovery, absolutely fundamental, obviously, but more recently we've taken the kind of the genetic basis of inheritance to new levels. And so some of the new insights coming out of the genomic literature has enabled us to kind of explore the intricate details of genetic networks and genomic networks. In particular, here, this is an example of a series of gene networks within the liver, okay, showing how individual genes are then interconnected, the operation of individual genes are then interconnected to one another. And what appears is clearly an incredibly complex series of interactions all occurring within the cell, within the genome. Okay. Third, the neural wiring of the brain and the basis of behavior. I think this is clearly one of the most impressive insights. That is the mechanistic understanding of behavior, but tracing that ultimately to the inner wiring of the brain, the circuitry of the neural system, and so on. And this is one example here that quite fascinated me. This is IBM's Big Blue. This is a supercomputer that they're attempting to create a detailed map of the circuitry of the neocortex. And again, this is the largest and most complex part of the human brain, trying to utilize a supercomputer to try to map all the interconnectances within the brain itself. And so fourth, the structure and function of ecosystems. Okay, so if we stand back and look at the world, obviously if you look out your window, there's a lot going on. And when we try then to understand all of this detail, one takes away that although if you go down to Costa Rica and look out over the canopy, it looks nice and green, but underlying that nice greenness and simplicity underlies about 100 tree species per 10th hectare. And to give you an idea of the total number of species that is obviously much more than you would have in the Czech Republic, but also on par to almost what we would have for the tree species in North America. So incredibly diverse in a very small area. And I can pull out several different examples of this complexity. Here's just one. Here is the cod for the fish, the cod in the North Atlantic. This is the food web of everything that essentially eats cod. And obviously cod is very important for understanding fisheries management. And obviously in order to regulate populations of cod, it's not a simple task. Obviously there are a lot of players in terms of what ultimately regulates populations of cod. Clearly quite complex. Okay, so for this talk, what I would like to do is step back and ask, besides the various forces of evolution, are there other general principles or other things that may be at work, okay, besides evolution by natural selection, that have shaped how organisms work, the evolution of diversity, and the functioning of ecosystems? Now, this is a pretty bold and maybe a dangerous question, and I'm not sure I can actually answer this. I think this is a reasonable question to ask, and so we're going to see what we learn from this. And so once you start asking these sorts of questions, you're immediately kind of thrust into this discussion of laws. And some of this is semantic, but I would like to just touch on this for a little bit. In particular, it's very interesting in biology that you do not really see discussion of laws. Well, you do, but it's mainly regulated to the philosophical literature. But in terms of biology, we don't really talk about laws. And so what's interesting, I just kind of tried to prove this to myself. And so if you just go to Wikipedia and you type in laws of science, okay, so biology is a science, right? And so I typed in, what are the laws of science? Well, this is what you get. Some of these things you've learned in chemistry and physics, so gas laws, Einstein's laws, thermodynamics, electromagnetic laws, quantum laws, Newton's laws, all these different laws. But one thing you will not see is any reference whatsoever to biology. Now, well, that's fine. Maybe we're happy with that. Okay, maybe biology maybe we don't need laws, or maybe what we mean about laws in biology is very different than what they mean in physics and chemistry and so on. Now, if you do the same thing, if you search for biological law or something like that, laws of biology or biology and law, this is what you get in Wikipedia. Okay? And I'm serious. You can do this yourself, okay? There's nothing in Wikipedia, which is actually impressive because I can usually find something in Wikipedia about anything that I type in, just randomly. But for biological law, there are no articles that match that title. So, well, why is that, okay? Why is that within biology, we don't really talk about laws? Well, it's been quite a bit of interesting reading to try to answer that question. And I found a very good quote from Stephen Jay Gould here. And he basically says that biological phenomena, at the level at which we would desire to have them explained, all right, so that's an important caveat here. So at the level that we want to have them explained, are too complex for us to formulate laws about them. Okay, so biology is just too complex. And so also in these writings, you get this notion that biology is really different than the rest of the sciences. What we study is definitely different than physics, okay? Now, for this talk, what I would like to really ask is, well, is biology really too complex, okay? Now, that seems right, but has anyone actually said, well, hold on, wait a minute. Is that true? Is biology too complex? Is it really different from the rest of the sciences? And so the thesis for my talk is that I'm going to argue that biology needs to rethink what we mean by laws, but also argue that we need to actually embrace what we mean by laws. And I'm being fuzzy about that, but hold on. But we should also ask ourselves, well, why should we care about laws? Why should we concern ourselves about laws? Well, what is a law? Well, in an attempt to try to answer this, I'm going to show you some insights from the studies of complexity, from complex adaptive systems. I'm going to try to give you what I think are some examples of law-like phenomena. These may not be, but I think that there may be something there. And then I'm going to give you some conclusions. Okay? So, let's start off. So, is biology really too complex? Is it really different? Okay, so it's this notion that, well, biology is very different. It's very different from the rest of the sciences. And this notion actually goes way back kind of in time. And what was interesting is that you can find some very good quotes here. So this is from Immanuel Kant, okay? And in his third critique of pure reason, he says, "It's quite certain that we can never adequately come to know the organized beings and their internal possibilities in accordance with mechanical principles of nature." Right? So we can never. Right? It would be absurd for humans to hope that there may yet arise a Newton who could make comprehensible even the generation of a blade of grass according to natural laws. And so this is where he gets really dark and mean. He says, rather, we must absolutely deny this insight to human beings. Oh, okay. Well, why? Okay. Well, let's fast forward to just 2 years ago. Okay, so here is a paper that appeared, actually an essay that appeared in Nature. Okay, so here we are in February 2007. Again, this notion, biology is different than the physical sciences. And so this is by Evelyn Fox Keller, and a paper entitled A Clash of Two Cultures. A Clash of Two Cultures. So physicists come from a tradition of looking for all-encompassing laws. But is this the best approach to use when probing complex biological systems? And so she has a good quote saying that life is both contingent and particular. So life is contingent and particular. Each organism is the product of eons of tinkering and building on what had accumulated over the course of a particular evolutionary trajectory. Okay? So biology is different than the physical sciences, and the approach that maybe physicists have to study physics should be different to our approach to studying biology. Okay, we can crystallize this feeling into actually a very nice hypothesis or a thesis, okay? And it's something known as the evolutionary contingency thesis. And it has its roots actually in a physicist by the name of Max Delbrück, who was a physicist that turned biologist, and he actually did some very good work with unicellular organisms and genetics. But this idea was crystallized by Stephen Jay Gould and then more formalized by philosopher John Beatty, who has more formally published this thesis. And it's called the evolutionary contingency thesis. And some of you may know this by Stephen Jay Gould's book, It's a Wonderful Life, published in 1989, where he did the thought experiment. So if we were to rewind the tape of evolutionary history and play it again, all right, so if you rewound everything, then let evolution proceed, the results would not be the same. We get something different. We may not get humans, may not get dinosaurs. We get something different. And according to the evolutionary contingency hypothesis or thesis, there are two main reasons that natural law does not necessitate biological law. Okay, and I promise this is really the only bit of citation of the philosophy literature that I'm going to do for this talk, although I'm happy to talk more in detail about this. But the first point is that the predominance of traits in biology, so traits meaning attributes of organisms, so the predominance of traits in biology are not fixed, but caused by conditions that change with time. Okay? So we can summarize this by saying, well, evolution is evolving. Okay? Organisms are evolving. Things are changing. Everything biological is bound in time and space. Okay? So nothing that we can learn in biology has any permanent validity. Truth changes over time. Okay? The second point, all right, evolution, even from the same starting point, given the same environmental pressures, can by random chance and random mutation lead to completely different outcomes. Okay? So traits are not fixed over time, and from the same starting point, we're going to have different outcomes. Another way to say that is that there exists many satisfactory ways to adapt a given adaptation to one's environment. Okay, so this is the evolutionary contingency hypothesis. And the reasoning goes thus: if evolution is only contingent and is to some degree a random process, then its products must be as well. Life is contingent. Okay, it's contingent on what happened in the past. And because of which, biology is fundamentally different from the physical sciences, and that while evolution may be universal, biology and evolution itself is not governed by laws. That's the argument. Okay. So in a sense, we've now kind of understood the root of maybe why, when you search Wikipedia, you don't find biological laws. Okay. Now, what I find interesting is that idea, the evolutionary contingency hypothesis, does not appear to be embraced by all biologists. And probably a really good paper that I could point to is actually one published relatively recently by Sir John Lawton, a famous ecologist in the UK. And what he claims is that essentially the evolutionary contingency thesis, the ECT, has induced what he calls a WEWAC culture in biology. Okay. Just out of curiosity, does anyone know what a WEWAC is? Okay. So essentially, he published this paper, it's a short little essay in Oikos in 1995 titled Webbing and WEWACs. And essentially what John described was he was pointing out that there appears to be a descriptive culture in biology of celebrating complexity for complexity's sake, okay? Relishing in the complexity. And a WEWAC, according to John Lawton, is somebody who comes from the world is infinitely wonderful and complex school of natural history. Okay, so WIWCS. Okay, so world is infinitely wonderful and complex school of natural history. So according to John, the real danger of the evolutionary contingent thesis is that one only relishes complexity for complexity's self. Okay. And so for my thesis, okay, what I'm essentially arguing is that we have a sense that maybe since Darwin, biology, at least in parts of it, has gone astray. Maybe that's a harsh thing to say, and I'm not sure if I completely believe this, but there's this notion that biology has somehow gone astray. Yes, biology is very complex, but what I will argue in the next series of slides is that fundamentally biology is not different than the rest of the sciences, and that perhaps biology has too quickly embraced the evolutionary contingent thesis, and that the basic process of science is the same and it should be based on the discovery of laws. Okay, so why concern ourselves with laws? Why should biologists be concerned with laws? Well, laws are the foundation of science. Okay? They allow insight and they're the basis for prediction. Okay? Prediction. We are facing unprecedented biological troubles ahead. Okay? The world that we're entering has a lot of scary things that are going to happen. We need to predict and we need to understand big important things. Accelerated global warming, global change, the collapse of biological diversity, the altering of ecosystem function, emerging diseases, the need to better the human condition in an increasingly crowded and polluted world, etc., etc. Okay? As scientists, we need to confront this world and better anticipate, understand, and predict what may happen. Okay? The evolutionary contingency thesis may hamper our ability to adequately address, okay, these issues. Okay, the emphasis on biological laws will also speed unification and synthesis of knowledge, and hence application to applied and academic challenges. Okay, so it's really this quest then to try to understand if there and are there biological laws. That's why we should concern ourselves with laws. Okay, so we've been talking about laws, but what is a law? And part of this may be semantic, okay? But I'm going to try to deal with that right now. Well, one has a connotation of what a law is. right? Well, it's the connotation that something that can't be broken, right? Well, is general and applies to all, is omnipotent, okay, these are big words, is universal, okay? But if I were to essentially collapse everything and try to summarize what I appear to understand from the literature, and that a law is something about the world around us that is universal in space and time. Okay, so are there any aspects of biology that could match this? Is there anything biological, okay, that is essentially universal in space and time? Okay, so what is a law? Well, let's find some good quotations from people who can help us out. So this is quotation from the physicist Richard Feynman, okay? And so in this quote he says, "Even the artists appreciate sunsets and the ocean waves and the march of the stars across the heavens, as we, the scientists," we're not artists, right? We're scientists. "We look at these things and we get an aesthetic pleasure from them directly on observation." Oh, we're kind of like artists in a way, because we notice that there's a rhythm and a pattern between the phenomena of nature. So there's a rhythm and a pattern to the phenomena of nature which is not apparent to the eye. Okay? You don't see it with the eye, but only to the eye of analysis. And it's these rhythms and patterns which we call laws. Okay? So here I would like to introduce this matching between this notion of pattern, okay, with law. Okay? Patterns and laws. It is rhythms and patterns that we find with analysis that we call laws. And this is from his book, The Character of Physical Law. All right. So if we can then pull out some quotes for some other people. All right, so this is the biologist Simon Levin at Princeton. And if we were to essentially summarize what science is, well, science is the process of discovering and describing pattern. Okay? But then two, it's then proposing mechanisms or processes to account for these patterns. Okay, so patterns are central. It's identifying patterns and trying to account for what causes these patterns. Understanding patterns in terms of the processes that produce them is the essence of science. Okay, so he's essentially reiterating what many other people kind of have come to know. And to just do my last bit of summarizing here, well, in sciences, what do we call a law? Well, a law is something that's general, something universal, but it's based on a pattern in nature. Okay? But then ultimately, our goal is that pattern can be translated into the language of mathematics. Okay? So science is then the search for general mechanisms that understand these patterns or these laws. Okay, so, that's fairly straightforward. Okay, but now let's return to this notion, now that we're at least talking about what a law is, patterns are. Now let's return to this notion about what about the uniqueness of biological complexity. So if you remember from the quote from Stephen Jay Gould, early on, there's this notion that biology really is unique. Biology is really different. Okay? And so what's interesting is that I have been influenced quite heavily by work at the Santa Fe Institute. And the Santa Fe Institute is a multidisciplinary place where historians, computer scientists, economists, physicists, biologists, anthropologists, mathematicians all go. And I started going when I was a graduate student, and it really freaked me out, okay? Because I felt very uncomfortable being trained as a biologist, but trying to talk with people well outside of my profession. But over the years, what I've come to realize is that many of these people are struggling with the exact same problems that we as biologists are struggling with. And many of these incredibly bright people at the Santa Fe Institute have come to describe what is known as complex adaptive systems. Okay? So biology really isn't very unique in our problems or our issues. Okay? So if you study economies or societies or artificial life or even very complex physical systems, we often find complex adaptive systems. Okay? And what's interesting is that the people at the Santa Fe Institute have essentially summarized and characterized across all these different systems, they all tend to share several things in common with one another. One is that they have many interacting parts. Okay? So they have a lot of different parts or players interacting with each other. Okay? Often these systems are far from equilibrium. Okay? They're often organized by the flow of energy or information. Okay? Often very far from equilibrium. We also see adaptation to environmental change, which means we got a feedback. Okay? So oftentimes we see feedbacks. There's this notion of irreversibility, okay, which should sound familiar, okay, because we just talked about this role of historical contingency. We see nonlinear effects, okay, that operate on different temporal and spatial scales. As the result of all of these, we can characterize extremely complex dynamics. And oftentimes what happens is that we can talk about emergent patterns. Okay? From these processes emerge then patterns and networks of interactions. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So quite possibly the best way to kind of explain some of these insights is to review just a little bit about what influenced the initial thinking on complex adaptive systems. Okay? And some of this work actually comes from mathematicians and physicists who are working at Los Alamos National Labs, actually kind of brought in part with the making of the atomic bomb, unfortunately. But there are several extremely bright people like John van Neumann and Stanislaw Ulam, who basically focused on the problem of what they called of self-replicating systems. Okay? And in general, biology obviously is a self-replicating, we have self-replication that happens, but this problem occurs in many different places. And so in order to help study the problem of self-replicating systems, they essentially came up with this tool. They coined the term cellular automation. All right, so what is a cellular automata? Well, basically what it is this discrete and iterative model. Okay, it consists of a series of grids. Okay, it's a regular grid, then it consists of a series of different cells, each in one of a finite number of states. Okay, and so this is the really important part. This grid then can be either finite or a number of different dimensions, but every cell, okay, so each cell within this grid has then a rule associated with it. Okay? A rule then that is updated based on the values of the cells in its neighborhood. So a given cell will then have a rule, but it's then going to be influenced by the patterns and dynamics, the rules of the cells around it. So each time the rules are applied to the whole grid, a new generation is created. Okay, so this is the basics of cellular automata. And one can take an entire class on this. In many ways, I'm doing a disservice by trying to summarize this very quickly. But I'm going to give you one example of how very simple rules can give incredibly complex phenomena. Okay? And so what we're looking at is the time evolution starting at initial time, going through to later time. And this is a cellular automata model, okay, of a slime mold. Okay? And it's based on a few very simple rules. Okay? And so we're going to simulate slime mold movement and aggregation based on just 4 very simple rules. Now, if one were just look at this pattern, this, yes, it looks complex, and maybe there's some, non-random pattern associated with it. Maybe these individuals tend to be maybe further dispersed by chance. And what you're actually looking at here are individual slime molds in this simulation. The color represents the density of cells. Okay, so red here indicates a very high concentration of cells. So in order to create this pattern, one has to put in each of these cells just 4 different rules. The first rule for a cell to obey is deposit a pheromone. Then the second rule would then be, in the next iteration, pick an initial random direction to move in. All right, so just move randomly after you lay down a pheromone. Then the third rule would then be, well, search the surrounding 8 cells for the highest pheromone level, and then move toward it. Okay? With just those 4 simple rules, one can create essentially behavior that mimics the movement, aggregation, okay, of slime molds. Just one example. And to very quickly summarize this literature, I think some of the central insights from cellular automation is essentially that you can create extremely complex phenomena from very simple rules. Okay? And this complexity is generated by the repetition of these rules, okay, through the time course then of the system that you're interested in. So in contrast to the evolutionary contingency thesis, these rules are constant, independent of time and space. Okay? And they're just repeated throughout the entire simulation. But what emerges then are patterns, something that mimics nature. Okay. Now, there are an incredible number of different patterns and shapes and phenomena that one can simulate with cellular automata, all patterns generated with just very simple rules. And if you're really interested in this, I would highly suggest the, I'm trying to find the right words for this tome. It's Diabolical, I think, is the best. This book is huge. I don't know if you've seen this. This is a book published in 2002 by Stephen Wolfram. Does anybody know who Stephen Wolfram is? I'm sorry? Yeah, he's basically created Mathematica, if you use Mathematica. But he also summarized most of his research in this amazing tome. And it's boldly titled A New Kind of Science. And in this book, he basically comes up with, from the study of cellular automation across many different complex adaptive systems, he's come to summarize all of these complex adaptive systems into one general principle, okay, or one general law. And it's called the principle of computational equivalence. And I have to say, I'm honest, I don't understand it. I've tried to understand it, but I don't quite understand it. But if you're interested, I would point you to this. And essentially what he has been arguing is culminating all of this research into, this is a fairly recent book, and that is there's an algorithmic basis to pattern in complex system. Okay? So pattern, very nice pattern, can be created by very simple rules, but can also lead to very complex dynamics. So what are the lessons? Okay, well, there's some not so good lessons. In one way, certain aspects of complex adaptive systems are very difficult, if not impossible, to predict. So the actual temporal dynamics are very difficult to predict, based even if you put in the very simple rules. Yes, there are many different interacting parts on different temporal and spatial scales. The system obviously is nonlinear. Small differences in the environmental conditions, time lags can influence the structure and dynamics. Gosh, so we have many interacting parts, nonlinearities. Generality and predictability is limited to certain scales. And the system can be highly idiosyncratic. And because of which, you're also influenced by historical contingency, like we talked about earlier. But the most important take-home point, and this is the good news, is that general patterns do emerge, and complexity emerges from simplicity. So, the good news, on a macroscopic level, okay, on a macroscopic level, the structure and behavior of some aspects of complex systems may be predictable and are reflected in general patterns of statistical attributes and distributions. Okay. And underlying this complexity lies simple rule. And to me, one of the biggest insights of the Santa Fe Institute is just because you see something that's complex doesn't necessarily mean that the route by which that emerged was also complex. You have to first reject the notion that you can create that complexity with very simple rules. Okay. So then the good news is that what we should be doing is searching for these rules. These rules produce predictable patterns in macroscopic structure and dynamics. And again, as I mentioned earlier, even though we see what appears to be contingency, these rules then are independent of space and time. Okay. And if that's true, then arguably that would be a law based on everything that I've told you so far. Okay, so are there simple rules underlying biological complexity? And does such complexity have any sort of pattern? Okay. So I started this talk by talking about Darwin. And I think we should return to Darwin because I think Darwin can actually tell us something. In fact, everything that I've essentially told you, I think Darwin already told us. And it wasn't until I went back and read Darwin that I realized this. So let's, what I'm calling Darwin's forgotten insight, or maybe it's just reflecting my forgetting to read Darwin more than I should. Okay. So, in the last paragraph of The Origin of Species, there's a very famous part. It's essentially entitled The Entangled Bank, and I know several of you know this. But I think it's important for us to return to this because Darwin tells us something very important. And so here he is sitting outside his cottage, and he says, "It's interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth." Sounds great. I'd like to have a picnic here, right? All right. And to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and so dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Darwin uses laws. Why have we forgotten to use laws? Okay? Now, he goes on after this to actually tell us something about complex biological systems. Okay? In fact, what Darwin essentially argues is something very algorithmic. All right, so these laws, in a sense, being, okay, so I'm just going to continue on reading, and I'm going to then list through these laws. Okay? The first being growth and reproduction. Okay, well, that's Evo Devo, okay? All right, growth and reproduction, that's his first law. His second law is inheritance, which is almost implied by reproduction. I like that part. So inheritance, well, obviously this is genetics. Okay, 3, variability from indirect and direct action of the external conditions. Okay, the external conditions of life and form, use, and disuse. This is essentially, again, genetics, genomics, omics. This is the interaction then between gene and then the environment. Okay, and then he says, given all of the above, 1, 2, and 3, given those 3 plus 4, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to, now this is population biology, okay? So a rate of increase so high. So what is he referring to here? Okay, he's referring to Malthus's law. Okay, and so this is going back to obviously Malthus in 1798 on the essay of the principle of the population. Well, essentially any population. Okay, any population. Okay, so this is a universal statement. Any population, if left unchecked, has the potential to grow exponentially. Okay? Anything. Okay? Very much a law. This is Malthus's law. Food supply can never keep pace with human population growth. So, obviously, hopefully you've seen this, right? This is basic population biology, time, number of individuals, exponential growth. Here's the rate of increase of resources. Uh-oh, when those two lines intersect, right? That's when all the bad stuff happens, right? That's the point of crisis that he called it, right? So we can model that, whatever. Okay, so based on given 1, if 1, and 2, and 3, and then 4, that then leads to a struggle for life, okay, where resources are finite so that there's competition, and that as a consequence, okay, so this is all ecology, so the struggle for life because of finite resources, okay, remember these are Darwin's laws. As a consequence, we see natural selection. Because of each of those steps, okay, so evolution by natural selection isn't just one of these, okay? It's essentially the algorithmic carrying out of this. So we see natural selection, the divergence of character, and the extinction of less improved forms. Okay, so that's evolutionary biology, ecology, macroevolution, and so on. All right, so essentially we can boil all of biology down into this. Well, many of you may be saying, of course, this is obvious, but what's really interesting is that essentially Darwin has a lot to teach us, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute. So are these examples of law-like phenomena? So 1, evolution by natural selection is algorithmic. From general and universal biological rules emerges complex evolutionary dynamics. That's his entangled bank. Number two, the dynamics then produce patterns in biology. All right, well, we study all these patterns. We study these patterns at different scales. And again, ultimately, we can describe these patterns in terms of the language of mathematics. Okay, essentially doing everything that I've told you earlier in terms of a definition of what a law is. Okay, so arguably, yes, these are examples of law-like phenomena that Darwin has already laid out in biology. Okay, so are there other examples? Because remember, one of the central arguments of the evolutionary contingency thesis is that, well, this is still just evolution, okay? But other than these principles, maybe that, all right, fine, maybe there's several laws that Darwin talked about, all right, maybe I'll concede you that. But there are no other laws, okay? These are the main ones we need. But I do think that it's important for us to actually step back and say, yes, okay, we agree with that, but, well, are there other examples, okay? Are there other law-like phenomena that ultimately govern, then, the entangled bank? Well, what I would like to do is that, well, maybe there are hints of several other general patterns in law-like phenomena in biology. Patterns that may be universal, okay? I'm not entirely on board yet, but they may be universal and independent of scale. Okay. So let me go through and then highlight. I'm going to give you maybe 3 examples of this, I think, in the interest of time. Okay. And so the first example is essentially the problem of scaling organismal dimensions. I've talked a little bit about this in the past, but what's actually very interesting is that we've known this for a very long time. Okay? That we can go back actually to Galileo, who essentially argued that, well, in general, organisms must obey universal scaling principles. Okay? Again, these are outside of natural selection, but are based on things like biomechanics, hydrodynamics, other things. Okay? And so he says one cannot argue from the small to the large because many devices which succeed on a small scale do not work on a large scale. And he gives several examples. One of the more famous is talking about bones. Okay? In particular, he says that nature cannot produce a horse as large as 20 ordinary horses or a giant 10 times taller than ordinary man, unless by miracle or some greatly altering the proportion of his limbs and especially his bones, which have to be considerably enlarged over the ordinary. And essentially what he began to argue is the basis of dimensional analysis, and that is weight of anything, be it an organism, be it a beam, a mast on a ship. Weight must increase to the third power of linear dimension in order for it to remain as equally strong. Okay? So thus, large bodies must have disproportionate thicker ones. Okay? This is basically the foundation of biomechanics. Okay? That you have to scale proportion of organisms in order to work. Okay? Because the forces of gravity and so on, because of basic dimensional analysis, larger organisms tend to have thicker bones than smaller ones because if they didn't have thicker bones, organisms would collapse under their own weight. That was essentially the argument. Well, we can fast forward again, and many of these arguments of scaling organismal dimensions, that is changes in mass, changes in length and volume, we can all boil down essentially to the findings of allometry, and the term allometry was actually coined by Julian Huxley. How many Huxleys do you know? Okay, I know several, and actually they're all related, which is very interesting. And essentially, Julian Huxley in 1932 coined the term allometry, allo then meaning different, metry then being measure. And essentially, what Huxley discovered, and this is his book, Problems of Relative Growth, that if you looked at essentially any trait of an organism, any 2 traits of an organism, and you looked at how if you changed the relative magnitude of one trait and you measured the other trait, what he actually found was that traits tend to be very tightly linked to each other in terms of their relative dimensions. Right, the most famous being some of these allometric relationships, and there's a gazillion of them. I can just show one from actually, this is interesting, he uses a plant example in essentially the opening of his book, which he entitles The Problems of Relative Growth, and he identifies what he calls constant differential growth ratios. Okay, these are growth ratios that are constant over time, okay, as an organism grows. And so he plots for several different species of plants. This is for a cotton plant, a pea plant. This is a carrot and a turnip. The root mass versus the stem mass. And as you can see, there's a very nice functional relationship that says that as you increase root mass, stem mass tends to change in terms of a certain proportion. So for any organism, thanks to Huxley, what we now know is that most traits of organisms change in regular proportion with each other over time and with differences in their sizes. And so they're scaled with each other so that these proportions are essentially equal, their ratios are essentially equal to each other, independent of time as an organism grows. And you can boil Huxley's allometric scaling law down to a very simple argument where you have an organismal attribute y is equal to some constant multiplied by organism size raised to some exponent. So what is absolutely fascinating is that despite enormous complexity in gene interactions, metabolic pathways, differences in development, you can still describe the ontogeny of a very complex organism by a very simple relationship. So essentially, anything you can measure in biology of an organism can be described by this equation. Now, okay, fine, maybe not everything, but you'll find that it applies in a lot of different situations. Okay. And so probably one of the more famous ones is a relationship made famous by Max Kleiber and updated fairly recently. And so this is mass-corrected growth rate of plants and animals. So going from very small organisms to very large ones. And this is the rate of individual biomass production. And this is actually temperature corrected, but doesn't really change the result. And what we're looking at is several different organisms ranging from plants, mammals, all the way down to birds and fish and insects, plotted all together. And what you actually find is that growth rate, which is obviously the result of a lot of complexity in terms of biochemistry, the energetics of growth, and so on. Given all of that complexity, nonetheless, there appears to be some general patterns that is independent of the scale of the organism. So Bill Calder has made famous several other of these examples. Here, if we look at any sort of biological time, so this is for birds, you can do this for mammals, insects, and I think even plants, you'll get a very similar picture. What Bill Calder is summarizing here is body mass of different birds, ranging from small birds to big birds, versus various different times. Okay, a lot of different times. And what's interesting is that if you look at different body cycles, ranging from fast muscle contraction rate to cardiac cycle to respiratory cycle, you can essentially describe all of these times, how these times change with body mass according to very similar exponents of 1 over 4. So this is body cycles. We can scale up to physiological times. That is how fast it takes for a bird to metabolize fat, the insulin clearance time, the circulation of blood. We can then go up to growth and reproductive times. This is for populations, how fast it takes to achieve 98% growth, how fast it achieves reproductive maturity, incubation period, and finally lifespan itself. But it doesn't matter. All of these different times all scale about the same. Okay, so those are a few examples of biological scaling. But what really interests me is that there are a lot of cases of biological invariance, okay, things that actually don't change, okay? And some of these are a little less well known, but I find them absolutely fascinating because they suggest the operation of something general or a general rule independent of both time and probably also in space. So many attributes of organisms don't change with changes in their size, don't change as you go from very small things to large things, and actually many attributes of organisms don't change if you compare dramatically different clades. So what are some of these examples? Well, let's just pull kind of a few from, this is an example from Bill Calder, And what's actually very interesting is that if you plot the frequency of heartbeats, if you measure the frequency of heartbeats of an organism, and you divide it by the frequency of breaths, that is how fast you breathe, so your heart rate divided by how fast you breathe, for any mammal, and you can also do this for birds, you can also do this for reptiles, you tend to get similar answers, but you actually get a dimensionless number, okay? You actually just get a number. And what you get is 4.5. Okay, so for any mammal, on average, you get a constant. On average, the heart beats 4.5 times per respiration. Okay, why is that? I have no idea, and I don't know of anyone who actually knows why it's 4.5. Okay, but what's very interesting is that across all mammals, on average, this is the case. Well, what about the total number of heartbeats in a lifetime? This is actually very interesting, and it was actually reported originally by Stahl in the early 60s. If you take the lifespan and the total number of heartbeats divided by your lifespan, what you actually get is a constant, and it's about 7.3 plus or minus 5.6 times 10 to the 8th. Approximately a billion. Okay. So across all mammals, and you can do this for birds, you can do this for any major clade, you get similar numbers. And so here's just a way of plotting it. This is number of beats per lifetime and the weight. So going from a hamster and a rat, here's man right there. Okay, here's a tiger and a whale. You get about 1 billion heartbeats. So I know what you're thinking. And that is, you better use them wisely, okay? So you only have 1 billion, so don't use them all at once, okay? So the total number of heartbeats on average is about 1 billion, okay? I know of no theory, okay? I know of no physiological, I know of no evolutionary explanation for why it should be approximately 1 billion. Okay. There are several other of these invariants. Okay, so this is from Bill Calder. These are essentially known as Calder's invariant biological times. We looked at a few of these. If you then divide lifespan by reproductive maturity, okay, for birds here you get a number, 20.8. If you divide blood circulation by the cardiac cycle, you get about 86.7. Okay, the time you metabolize fat, okay, and divided then by the blood volume, okay, you get about 472. Well, why do you get these numbers? Okay, these numbers just appear. The point is, some things of organisms don't change. Okay, these appear to reflect something fundamental about how you put together a bird, or a mammal, or a plant. And we really don't understand why these numbers are, okay, the way they are. There's also something known as a life history invariant. Okay, and Eric Charnoff has made these fairly famous, although I don't really find a lot of reference to them. And what he finds is that there are a lot of different invariants with life histories. And so if you take the ratio of a lifespan, okay, and the age of maturity, there's an approximate constant that appears to be very unique to a given clade. And within that clade, it appears to characterize all the organisms in that clade and doesn't appear to change within that clade. So for example, if you take this ratio, and it's a dimensionless ratio, there are no units associated with it, it's just a number. For birds, mammals, lizards, and snakes, fish and shrimp, you get different values. But again, we don't have a mechanistic, physiological, evolutionary explanation for why these numbers are the way they are. So if you look outside and you study birds, you study mammals, and we think that these also hold up for plants, why should they be approximately constant? Okay? Charnoff makes the very strong argument that they reflect something fundamental about not only how evolution works, but also how the body is put together and the energetics of life. So there are more invariants. You take the ratio of clutch size to yearly adult instantaneous mortality rate, the yearly clutch size multiplied by the age of first reproduction, the weaning mass divided by the adult mass. Charnoff claims you get an approximate invariant number. Okay, so let me then go on to talk about, this is actually the third point, it's not the second point, but some energetic principles. This is my last series of examples before I closed. So, are there any sort of energetic principles? Okay, so to quote actually Boltzmann in 1886, he has the very bold statement that the fundamental object of contention in the life struggle in the evolution of the organic world is available energy. Okay, energy is very important. And what's actually very interesting is that several people have pointed to this, and again, I don't see any understanding about where these numbers come from. This is from Stahl in 1962, who originally pointed to this. Several other people have also further improved in this. If you actually calculate the total amount of energy fluxed per mass per lifetime of an organism, it's approximately a constant value. All right? So in general, there's some variability on this, but across most organisms, and this number appears to be very similar even for plants and animals, you get about 8 times 10 to the 5th kilojoules per kilogram. Okay. Now, it doesn't matter if you're a mouse, an annual, okay, or a giant sequoia or a blue whale, per unit mass, you flux about the same amount of energy. Now, again, why is this? It's a little unclear, okay? But it changes your perspective a little bit when you start thinking about, okay, how these biological diversity may evolve, but also what may be kind of ultimately structuring variability in life histories and ecologies. Now, this isn't just something that somebody discovered a long time ago. This is in the most recent PNAS, okay? In fact, I just read it last night, okay? Here's a paper entitled A Universal Constant for Heat Production in Protists. And they looked across 5 different phyla of eukaryotic protists, okay? Many different things, okay? And they had an incredibly fancy machine that enabled them to measure this. They're actually very proud of it. If you read the paper, they kind of talk about how wonderful this machine is. And they were able to measure the metabolic heat production per unit mass of carbon across a very impressive diversity of sampling of protists. And what they found was an approximate constant number. You get about 0.037 picowatts per picogram of carbon. Okay? Now, what's interesting is why is that? Despite this amazing diversity, we see some underlying aspects that appear not to change, okay? Even though protists evolutionarily are incredibly diverse and have a very rich and lush evolutionary history. So across each one of these different phyla and clades, we see approximately the same number. So the last point that I want to then point out in terms of kind of energetics is this notion of a zero-sum dynamic. Okay? The notion of a zero-sum dynamic has been argued recently to ultimately govern a lot of ecological and evolutionary dynamics of populations and species. And it actually has its root, and many people don't know this, in the classical understanding of the Red Queen hypothesis. Okay? So the Red Queen hypothesis ultimately comes from Lewis Carroll. And essentially the quote is, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. And it was Van Valen in 1973 who coined the Red Queen hypothesis. And the Red Queen hypothesis states that for an evolutionary system, continuing development is needed just in order to maintain its fitness relative to the systems that it's co-evolving with. In other words, there will be a constant evolutionary arms race between competing species of predator and prey. So when you learn kind of introductory evolution, ecology, and you learn about the Red Queen hypothesis, in general, this is where the textbooks stop. What they don't tell you is that Van Valen went on to elaborate the Red Queen hypothesis, all entirely based on something fundamental about organismal energetics. And unfortunately, people don't cite this. And that is, he argues that there is a more deeper origin to the Red Queen hypothesis, and that is an energetic zero-sum. And basically what Van Valen argues is that a change in the control of trophic energy by a species, okay, so the amount of resources available to a species, is balanced in nature by a net equal and opposite change in the amount of trophic energy controlled by all other species, which that species interacts. There's an energetic zero-sum principle in nature, is what Van Valen is arguing. That is the basis of the Red Queen. So if any species obtains more energy, somebody else has to lose some energy. It's a zero-sum game. And basically, he equates trophic energy to ultimately a proxy for fitness. And so the Red Queen hypothesis emphasizes that under resource limitation, zero-sum dynamics must operate. And he argues that zero-sum dynamics have been fundamental and essentially constant since essentially when life first was seeded on Earth. Now, do we have evidence for zero-sum dynamics, a zero-sum energetic Red Queen? Now, this is a little bit more contentious, but it looks as if maybe we do. Maybe we have a basis to actually test Van Valen's original assumption. Yes. And this is a paper by Tim Kitt and Eugene Stanley, published in Nature in 1998. Many people don't actually know of it. I think it's actually a brilliant paper. What they did was they took from the breeding bird survey, and breeding bird survey is a series of routes or plots in the United States. These were these red dots where people go out and watch birds, and they count how many birds are there. And what Kitt and Stanley did is they calculated each species' growth rate across the BBS for the 31 years of the entire data set. So this is a continent-wide measure of changes in abundance and diversity. And what they did was calculate bird species population growth rates. And this is what they found. They found a pattern like this. And so on the x-axis is population growth rate. And the y-axis is the probability density, the probability of a given rate of growth. And this graph looks kind of funky and weird at first. I'm going to just explain it very quickly. Essentially, you can, if you notice, on one side we have positive numbers, on another we have negative numbers. On this side we have decreases in population fluctuations or decreases in population size. On the other is increases in population size. And what I would like you to notice is that this distribution is symmetrical. All right? It's centered on 0. All right? What that means is that as many species are increasing in abundance as are decreasing in abundance. Okay? Essentially a zero-sum game. While some species are increasing in abundance, others are decreasing in abundance. So the species zero-sum dynamic in population size with demographic gains and losses by all species balancing each other over the entire study period. Now this is on a continental-wide scale. Essentially what would be expected given the zero-sum Red Queen. So are there more general patterns in biology? I could probably sit here for a while, but what I would do is actually I would encourage you to actually read one of David's very nice papers here published in Science, where again David returns back to the entangled bank. And David essentially puts out a very nice argument that general patterns in contemporary biodiversity actually do exist. Again, patterns. We see general patterns in biology, such as scaling relationships or species area laws, frequency distributions of species extinction, and abundances. Reveal scale invariance, okay? Reveal the possibility of underlying rules that are independent with time and space, suggesting that simple rules underlie the structure and function of ecosystems. I was going to give some examples, but I'm sure you've probably heard through David several of these, so I didn't want to tread on his territory. So just to then kind of conclude, I've now kind of given you in this talk, we talked about this notion of, well, is biology too complex and is it really different? Okay? I've essentially argued that no, biology really isn't that different. Many other complex adaptive systems are out there. My entire thesis is that biology needs to rethink and embrace biological laws. And essentially I've equated laws with patterns. Okay? The search for general patterns and hopefully in our understanding of what is a law to try to find any sort of general principle then that would be independent of scale, that is time and space. Now, examples of law-like phenomena, well, I think maybe I showed you some tantalizing pieces, okay, of things that we don't understand, but these appear to be sufficiently important that we should definitely consider rethinking the existence of general patterns and laws in biology. And so then to conclude, so yes, biology is complex, okay? And biology is not physics. Okay. All right. We really are different than physicists in a way, but all right. I basically argue that the approach of science and biology should be no different than the rest of the sciences. Okay. We really should be no different in terms of trying to search for general patterns and uncover if there are more simple general rules that underlie complexity. But also I'd like to point out that Darwin really was ahead of his time. Okay? Many of the insights from complex adaptive systems, that is, one can create very complex patterns with very simple underlying rules that are algorithmic in nature, is essentially what he laid out in his argument. So complexity can emerge from simple and general rules. So we need to look more for and describe general patterns, not just describe. Describing is important, but we need to go beyond that and look for more general patterns. We need to describe these patterns mathematically and propose then simple, more general underlying rules for the generation of pattern. And I cannot stress that we really do need to do this because the world desperately requires a more synthetic and predictive biology if we're going to face and deal with, hopefully successfully, a lot of the problems that we face. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for spending your time and listening to me, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.